1345, Florence, Italy. A single word arrived from London that would destroy two empires built over centuries. Default. The Bardi and Peruzzi, the J.P. Morgan of the 14th century, the most powerful financial institutions in the medieval world. Branches from London to Constantinople, control over the wool trade, financing for popes and kings. Gone, in a single moment of royal betrayal. This wasn't a market crash. This wasn't a business miscalculation. This was a financial execution, and the king held the axe. To understand the magnitude of this collapse, you need to understand what the Bardi and Peruzzi actually were. These weren't just banks, they were infrastructure. The Bardi family operated branches in 16 European cities: London, Paris, Bruges, Barcelona, Naples, Cyprus, Rhodes, Jerusalem. Their network moved money, goods, and information faster than any government could. The Peruzzi were equally vast, 15 branches, control over grain shipments from Sicily, monopolies on alum and spices. Together, they financed the papacy, managed the wool export trade between England and Flanders, and underwrote the ambitions of Europe's most powerful monarchs. But here's where the story shifts from commerce to catastrophe. Both banks made a fatal decision. They transitioned from trade finance, profitable, diversified, manageable, to military finance, lending to kings for war. And their primary client? Edward III of England, the man who would destroy them. 1337. Edward III declares himself the rightful king of France. The 100 Years' War begins. War is expensive, catastrophically expensive. Medieval armies required knights, archers, siegecraft, supply chains, and mercenaries. Edward needed capital immediately. Tax revenue was too slow. Confiscation was politically dangerous. So he borrowed. From the Bardi, from the Peruzzi. And they lent eagerly. Why? Greed. The interest rates on royal loans were extraordinary: 10, 15, sometimes 20%, far higher than trade finance could ever generate. But more than that, royal favor meant monopoly. The king could grant exclusive wool export licenses, waive customs duties, provide military escorts for trade caravans. The Bardi and Peruzzi convinced themselves they weren't lenders, they were partners with the crown. This was the fatal illusion. By 1340, Edward III owed the Bardi alone over 900,000 florins, the Peruzzi another 600,000. Combined approximately 1.5 million florins, in modern terms equivalent to hundreds of millions of pounds. This was concentration risk at suicidal scale. Both banks had lent the majority of their capital to a single debtor, a debtor fighting an unwinnable war against the wealthiest kingdom in Europe. The debt was growing, the war was stalling, and the banks capped lending. Because stopping meant admitting the previous loans were at risk, and admitting that meant collapse. So they doubled down, extended more credit, sent more florins to England. They were trapped, hostage to their own greed and the illusion that kings always repay. 1344. Edward III's position is desperate. The French are resisting. His military campaigns have drained the treasury. Parliament is refusing additional taxes. His soldiers are deserting for lack of pay. And the debt, the unfunded liabilities to Italian bankers, have become a noose around the crown's neck. Edward faces a choice, a cold, ruthless calculation. Pay the debt and watch the kingdom collapse, or default and watch the banks collapse. He chooses the kingdom. 1345, Edward III repudiates his debts to the Bardi and Peruzzi. Not renegotiates, not restructures, repudiates. He declares the loans void, claims the interest rates were usurious, states that the royal prerogative supersedes contractual obligation. This is the moment that defines sovereign risk. A king doesn't need to honor contracts when he controls the courts, the armies, and the borders. Legal agreements are only as strong as the enforcement mechanism. And who enforces contracts against a king? No one. Edward's logic was brutally simple. If your debtor can arrest you, you are a hostage, not a creditor. The Bardi and Peruzzi had no recourse. They couldn't sue the King of England in English courts. They couldn't seize English assets. Those assets belonged to the king. They had traded contractual rights for political dependence. And when the king decided survival required default, their contracts became worthless paper. This was political will overriding financial obligation, the state choosing itself over its creditors. a pattern that would repeat throughout history, from Philip II of Spain to revolutionary France to Argentina's serial defaults. The lesson is eternal. Sovereigns default when survival demands it. The news reached Florence like a plague. The King of England has defaulted. Panic. Both banks had used depositor funds to finance the loans. Florentine merchants, nobles, and guilds had entrusted their wealth to the Bardi and Peruzzi, believing them invincible. Now those deposits were gone, locked in unpayable English debt. A medieval bank run began. Depositors stormed the bank's Florentine headquarters demanding their money. There was none. The vaults were empty. The capital was in England, in Edward's hands, irretrievable. The Bardi declared bankruptcy first, 1346. The Peruzzi followed, 1343, though some historians date final liquidation to 1346. But the contagion didn't stop there. The Bardi and Peruzzi owed money to dozens of smaller banks, trading houses, and merchant families. When they collapsed, those debts became worthless. Financial contagion spread through Florence like wildfire. The Acciaiuoli Bank, heavily exposed to the Peruzzi, failed. The Bonaccorsi followed. Dozens of Florentine businesses, dependent on credit from the great banks, couldn't access capital. Trade froze. Construction halted. Entire families were ruined. Historians estimate the collapse destroyed over half of Florence's financial capital. The city's economy contracted violently, political instability followed, riots, recriminations. This wasn't just two banks failing. This was systemic collapse triggered by a single sovereign's decision. One default, two banks, 50 bankruptcies, thousands of lives destroyed. And Edward III? He continued fighting his war. The English economy barely noticed. Because the consequences of sovereign default don't fall on the sovereign, they fall on the creditors. Here's what the Bardi and Peruzzi teach us, a lesson so fundamental that echoes through 7 centuries. Power hierarchy determines financial reality. Contracts matter only when both parties are subject to enforcement. When one party controls the enforcement mechanism, the courts, the armies, the sovereign authority, contracts become voluntary. And voluntary means revocable. The Bardi and Peruzzi forgot this. They believed their financial sophistication made them indispensable, that their economic importance granted them immunity. They were wrong. When push came to shove, Edward chose political survival over contractual honor, and there was nothing they could do about it. This is the essence of sovereign risk. The danger that a government facing existential pressure will simply refuse to pay. Not because it's bankrupt in the traditional sense, but because paying would be politically untenable. Now apply this to the modern world. US Treasury bonds, the safest asset in global finance, right? Backed by the full faith and credit of the United States government. But what happens if the U.S. faces a genuine fiscal crisis? If entitlement obligations, military commitments, and debt service become politically unsustainable? The U.S. could default. Not likely, but possible. Or consider China's holdings of U.S. debt, over $1 trillion in Treasury securities. Seems safe, until you realize that in a geopolitical crisis, the U.S. could freeze those assets, declare them subject to sanctions, render them worthless. If your debtor can arrest you or freeze your assets, you are a hostage, not a creditor. Or look at sovereign debt crises in Argentina, Greece, Venezuela, Russia. Every time the pattern repeats, the state prioritizes its survival over bondholders' claims. Because political will always trumps contractual obligation when the stakes are high enough. This is the warning the Bardi and Peruzzi died teaching. Never concentrate your wealth in obligations owed by those more powerful than you. Never assume that economic importance grants you immunity from political decisions. Never forget that when crisis comes, the powerful will sacrifice the creditors to save themselves. The Bardi and Peruzzi were the most sophisticated financiers in the medieval world. They had centuries of experience, networks spanning continents, relationships with popes and kings. And they were destroyed in a single moment by a king who decided their survival was less important than his. Greed blinded them to concentration risk. Concentration risk exposed them to sovereign risk. And sovereign risk killed them. 700 years later, the mechanism hasn't changed. Governments still borrow. Creditors still lend. And when the debt becomes unpayable, political will still determines who survives. The only question is, are you positioned like the Bardi and Peruzzi, trusting in contracts and the goodwill of the powerful? Or have you learned the lesson they died teaching? Power is the only real collateral. Everything else is just paper.